The elderly couple bought an old movie producer's storage. Inside were lost reels worth $50 million. The film canister fell from Arthur's trembling hands and hit the concrete floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the storage unit. And when his wife Helen bent to pick it up, she saw 3 words stamped on the rusted lid that made her heart stop. Hitchcock, original negative. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Arthur, Helen whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the storage facility's fluorescent lights. Arthur, look at this. Her husband stepped carefully around the towers of film canisters that filled the 10 by 20 unit they'd purchased just an hour earlier for $300. At 76, Arthur moved slowly, his replacement hip protesting every step. But when he saw what Helen was holding, he moved faster than he had in years. "That can't be real," he said, taking the canister from her. His fingers traced the embossed letters. "The Storm Within, Dr. Alfred Hitchcock, 1967. Original camera negative, Paramount Pictures." Helen pulled out her phone, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the screen. She'd been researching lost films for the past 3 years, ever since they'd started buying storage units as a way to supplement their Social Security checks and fill the empty hours of retirement. It had become her obsession, this catalog of missing cinema, films that had been destroyed or lost or locked away and forgotten. "Arthur," she said, her voice shaking as she read from her phone. "The Storm Within, Hitchcock's last film. It was never released." There were rumors that he'd finished it before he died in 1980, but Paramount shelved it after disastrous test screenings. Most people think it was destroyed. "How much?" Arthur asked, because after 40 years of marriage, he knew his wife well enough to know she'd already looked up the value. Helen's face had gone pale. If this is authentic, experts have estimated that if The Storm Within still exists, it would be worth anywhere from $40 to $60 million. It's considered one of the holy grails of lost cinema. They stood in silence, surrounded by hundreds, maybe thousands of film canisters, each one labeled with titles and dates and names. The storage unit belonged to someone named Leonard Voss, according to the auction paperwork. The name meant nothing to Arthur, but Helen had gone still, her eyes wide. "Leonard Voss," she breathed. "Oh my God, Arthur! Leonard Voss was a legendary producer. He worked with everyone. Hitchcock, Kubrick, Wilder. He died 3 months ago. I read his obituary in Variety." She was already pulling up information on her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Arthur moved deeper into the unit, carefully examining the other canisters. Each one bore similar labels: original negatives, work prints, director's cuts. Names he recognized, even with his limited knowledge of cinema. Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick, Billy Wilder, Jean-Luc Godard. "Helen," he called out, his voice cracking. "There are hundreds of them, maybe thousands." His wife joined him, and together they began carefully examining canisters, reading labels, trying to comprehend what they'd stumbled into. A complete director's cut of a Kubrick film no one had ever seen. Original negatives of a Wells project that had supposedly been lost in a fire. Work prints of French New Wave films that existed nowhere else in the world. "This isn't possible," Helen said, but the evidence was stacked floor to ceiling around them. How could all of this have ended up in a storage unit? Why didn't his estate? "Look at this," Arthur interrupted, holding up a dusty folder he'd found on a shelf. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Leonard Voss from various studios, directors, and preservation societies. Arthur read one aloud, dated 1995. "Dear Mr. Voss, We understand you may have materials from Mr. Hitchcock's final, unreleased project. The Academy Film Archive would be honored to discuss acquisition and preservation of these historically significant materials. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. There were more letters like it, spanning decades. Requests, offers, sometimes desperate pleas from film preservationists, studio executives, and directors' estates. All of them asking Leonard Voss to share his collection, to let these lost films be seen or at least preserved properly. And every single letter had been ignored. He kept them, Helen said slowly, the realization dawning. He kept them all for himself. He had a fortune in lost cinema, and he locked it away where no one could see it. Arthur found more folders, files on each major film, including authentication documents, acquisition records, and in some cases, detailed notes about how Voss had obtained the materials. Some had been purchased legitimately from studio liquidations. Others had been acquired through estate sales, given to him by directors before they died, or obtained through means that seemed deliberately vague. Helen pulled out another canister, this one labeled The Other Side of the Wind, Orson Welles, Complete Assembly, 1976. Her hands were shaking so violently now that Arthur had to take it from her. "People have been looking for this for almost 50 years," she whispered. "This film, Welles worked on it for over a decade. It was never finished, never released." Some footage was shown at festivals, but the complete film was thought to be scattered across different collections or lost entirely. There's been a completed version floating around since 2018, but this says it's from 1976. This could be Welles's original vision. Arthur set the canister down carefully, as if it might explode. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the value of what surrounded them. $50 million for the Hitchcock alone. But there were hundreds of other films here, each one potentially worth millions to collectors, museums, or studios. "We need to call someone," he said. "A lawyer, an appraiser, someone who knows about this stuff." "Who?" Helen asked. "Who do we call? If we tell the wrong people, they might try to take it, claim it belongs to the studios or the director's estates. We paid for this storage unit, Arthur. We won it fair and square at auction." "But did we?" Arthur countered, his voice rising slightly. "These films, they're not just property. They're art. They're history. They belong in museums, in archives where people can see them, where they can be preserved properly." Helen's face hardened. "We spent $300 we could barely afford on this unit, hoping for furniture we could resell, or maybe some electronics worth something. We live on $1,200 a month, Arthur. Our apartment is 400 square feet. We eat canned soup for dinner 3 nights a week because fresh meat is too expensive. Don't lecture me about what belongs where." The sharpness in her voice startled him. Helen wasn't usually like this. She was the gentle one, the peacemaker, the one who'd spent 30 years as a librarian, helping people find books and information without ever asking for recognition. But there was something desperate in her eyes now, something Arthur recognized because he felt it too. They were old, they were poor, they were invisible. And suddenly, impossibly, they were holding something worth more money than they could comprehend. "I'm sorry," Arthur said quietly. This is overwhelming." Helen's expression softened. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently. "I know, it's overwhelming for me too. But we need to be smart about this. We need to figure out what we have, what it's worth, and what our options are before we tell anyone." Arthur nodded slowly. She was right, of course. They needed information, needed to understand what they'd discovered before they brought anyone else into it. But even as he agreed, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings about greed, about the corrupting influence of sudden wealth, about how money changed people in ways they never anticipated. They spent the next 3 hours carefully documenting everything in the storage unit. Helen photographed each canister, each label, each piece of paperwork. Arthur created a spreadsheet on his old laptop, logging titles, directors, years, and any other information they could find. The sheer volume was staggering. Over 1,500 film canisters, plus boxes of scripts, production notes, contracts, and correspondence. By the time they finished their initial survey, the sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the rows of storage units. Arthur's hip was screaming in protest, and Helen's arthritic hands had seized up from all the typing and photographing. But they had a list, a catalog of cinematic treasures that most people thought were lost forever. "We need to rent a truck," Helen said as they locked the unit behind them. "It won't fit," Arthur pointed out. "We barely have room for ourselves." "Then we'll get another storage unit, somewhere else, somewhere no one knows about. We can't leave it here, Arthur. What if someone breaks in? What if the facility figures out what's here?" They drove home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Arthur kept thinking about Leonard Voss, this man who'd spent decades accumulating lost films and then locked them away where no one could see them. What kind of person did that? Was it love of cinema? Or was it something darker? The desire to possess what others couldn't have, to control access to art and history. And what did it say about Arthur and Helen that their first instinct wasn't to share this discovery with the world, but to hide it and figure out how to profit from it? Their apartment was on the third floor of a building that had seen better days, in a neighborhood that was gentrifying around them but hadn't quite reached their block yet. The stairs were narrow and steep, and by the time Arthur reached their door, he was breathing heavily, his chest tight with exertion. Inside, the space felt even smaller than usual. The kitchenette was barely large enough for one person to stand in. The bathroom had a shower stall so cramped that Arthur had to be careful not to bang his elbows on the walls. The main room served as living room, dining room, and bedroom, with a fold-out couch they'd bought at a yard sale 15 years ago. This was what their lives had become. After Arthur's factory closed and his pension evaporated in bankruptcy proceedings, after Helen's library eliminated her position in budget cuts, after their modest savings were depleted by medical bills and the simple grinding expenses of staying alive, they'd lost their house, moved into this apartment, and watched their world shrink until it fit into 400 square feet of desperation and quiet shame. Helen sat down heavily on the couch and pulled out her laptop. "I'm going to start researching buyers," she said. "Private collectors, museums, studios. We need to figure out who would pay the most." Arthur stood at the window, looking out at the street below. A young couple walked by, laughing, carrying shopping bags from stores Arthur and Helen could no longer afford to enter. A mother pushed a stroller, her face peaceful in the fading light. Normal people, living normal lives, unaware that 3 blocks away, 2 elderly people were sitting on top of a fortune that could change everything. "What if we just kept one?" he said suddenly. "The Hitchcock. We could sell everything else to museums or archives at fair prices, make sure the films are preserved and shared. But we keep the Hitchcock and auction it to private collectors. That one film could set us up for life." Helen looked up from her laptop, considering. "That could work," she said slowly. "It would let us do the right thing with most of the collection while still securing our future. We'd have enough money to live comfortably, maybe even help our grandchildren with college." Their granddaughter, Emma, was 17 and brilliant, already receiving acceptance letters from colleges her parents couldn't afford to send her to. The thought of being able to help her, to give her opportunities that wouldn't crush her with debt, made Arthur's chest ache with longing. "Let's sleep on it," Helen said. "Tomorrow we'll rent a truck and move everything. Then we'll figure out our next steps." But sleep didn't come easily that night. Arthur lay on the fold-out couch, listening to Helen's breathing beside him, and felt the weight of their discovery pressing down on his chest like a physical force. In one day, they'd gone from being invisible old people buying storage units for pocket change to being custodians of cinema history worth millions. The responsibility of it terrified him. Around 3 in the morning, Helen got up to use the bathroom, and Arthur heard her crying softly through the thin walls. When she came back to bed, he pretended to be asleep, giving her the privacy she needed for her tears. He understood. The relief of finally having a way out of poverty was so intense it felt like grief. The next morning, they rented a U-Haul truck and drove back to the storage facility. Arthur's plan was to move everything in one trip, to get the films somewhere safe and secure before anyone realized what they'd found. But as they pulled into the parking lot, Helen grabbed his arm. "Look," she said, pointing. A black Mercedes was parked in front of their storage unit. A man in an expensive suit stood by the door talking on his phone. As Arthur and Helen approached, he turned, and Arthur saw he was younger than he'd first appeared. Maybe 45, with the kind of polished appearance that came from money and privilege. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson," the man said, pocketing his phone. "I'm Sebastian Crane. I represent several private collectors who specialize in rare films." "How did you know our names?" Helen asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Crane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The storage facility is required to keep records of auction winners. I made a few inquiries. I hope you don't mind. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for the contents of this unit." "We haven't even opened it yet," Arthur lied. "We don't know what's inside." "Please," Crane said, his smile fading. "Let's not waste each other's time. I know exactly what's in there. Leonard Voss's collection has been the subject of rumors in certain circles for decades. The moment his storage unit went into foreclosure, people like me started paying attention." "People like you?" Helen repeated. "What does that mean?" "Collectors, preservationists, people who understand the value of what Leonard accumulated." Crane pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. "I'm authorized to offer you $5 million cash for the entire contents of the unit. The transaction can be completed within 24 hours. Arthur felt his knees weaken. $5 million! More money than they'd earn in multiple lifetimes. Enough to solve every problem, erase every worry, secure every future. But Helen's face had gone hard. $5 million, she said flatly. For a collection that includes a lost Hitchcock film alone worth $50 million. Do we look stupid to you, Mr. Crane? Crane's expression shifted, became more calculating. The Hitchcock film is only worth that much if it's authentic, if it's in viewable condition, and if you can prove provenance. Those are significant ifs, Mrs. Patterson. My offer accounts for risk, for the expenses of authentication, for the reality that much of what's in that unit may be damaged beyond repair. We'll take our chances, Helen said. Will you? Crane stepped closer, and something in his posture changed, became subtly threatening. Let me be very clear about the situation you're in. The studios will claim those films belong to them. Directors' estates will file lawsuits. The IRS will want their cut of any sale. By the time you navigate the legal complexities of what you found, you'll have spent hundreds of thousands on lawyers, and that's assuming you win, which you probably won't. Are you threatening us? Arthur asked, finding his voice. I'm informing you, Crane said smoothly. My offer includes handling all legal issues, all authentication, all transfers of ownership. You get $5 million, clean, and you walk away. The alternative is years of legal battles, media scrutiny, and probably ending up with nothing while you drown in legal fees. Are you threatening us? Arthur asked, finding his voice. I'm informing you, Crane said smoothly. My offer includes handling all legal issues, all authentication, all transfers of ownership. You get $5 million, clean, and you walk away. The alternative is years of legal battles, media scrutiny, and probably ending up with nothing while you drown in legal fees. Helen's hand found Arthur's, squeezing hard. "We need time to think about it." "You have 24 hours, Crane said. "After that, my offer drops to $3 million. And if you try to move the collection or contact any other buyers, my offer disappears." He pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket. "Here's a letter of intent and a confidentiality agreement. Read them carefully. My number is on the card." He walked back to his Mercedes and drove away, leaving Arthur and Helen standing in the parking lot, the envelope heavy in Helen's hands. $5 million, Arthur said quietly.
"It's not enough," Helen said, but her voice shook. "He's lowballing us because he thinks we're desperate." "We are desperate," Arthur pointed out. Helen turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. "I know. God, Arthur, I know we are. But if we take this offer, we're letting him rob us just because we're old and poor and scared. We're letting him profit off our fear." "Or we're being smart," Arthur said gently. "Helen, he's right about the legal issues. We can't afford lawyers. We don't know how to navigate this world. $5 million is more money than we ever dreamed of having. It would change everything for us." They stood in the parking lot for a long time, neither of them moving toward the storage unit. Finally, Helen opened the envelope and began reading the documents Crane had left. Arthur watched her face as she read, saw the way her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked like despair. "It's all here," she said finally. "Everything he threatened. Confidentiality clauses, liability waivers, assignment of all rights. If we sign this, we give up any claim to the films forever. We can't talk about what we found, can't share the story, can't do anything except take the money and disappear." "Is that so terrible?" Arthur asked. "Taking the money and disappearing?" Helen folded the documents carefully and put them back in the envelope. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Why do you think Leonard Voss kept all those films locked away? Why did he ignore all those letters from preservationists and museums?" Arthur considered. "I don't know. Control? Greed?" "I think he was afraid," Helen said softly. "Afraid that if he let the films go, if he shared them with the world, he'd lose the only thing that made him special. As long as he had them hidden away, he was important. He was the keeper of treasures, the man with secrets. The moment he shared them, he'd just be another old man with nothing." "What's your point?" Arthur asked, though he thought he knew. "My point is that we have a choice," Helen said. "We can do what Leonard Voss did, hold on to these treasures out of fear and desperation, letting them benefit no one. Or we can do what Sebastian Crane wants, hand them over to someone who'll probably do the exact same thing, just with better lawyers and more money. Or we can find a third option." "What third option?" Arthur asked. Helen looked at the storage unit, then back at her husband. "We find someone we trust. A film preservationist, a museum curator, someone who actually cares about these films as art, not as investments. We work with them to authenticate and preserve the collection, and then we negotiate from a position of knowledge instead of fear." "That could take months," Arthur said, "and in the meantime, we'll be fighting off people like Crane, probably getting sued, definitely drowning in expenses we can't afford." "I know," Helen said, "but Arthur, we've been invisible for so long. Nobody sees us, nobody cares what happens to us. We're just two more old people waiting to die. But this could matter. This could be something that means something beyond just our survival." Arthur wanted to argue, wanted to point out that survival mattered, that they'd earned the right to be selfish after decades of struggling. But looking at his wife's face, seeing the determination and hope there, he couldn't bring himself to say it. Okay, he said finally. Who do we call? Helen pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her research notes. There's a film preservation professor at UCLA, Dr. Evelyn Martinez. She's written extensively about lost films, and she's worked with multiple major archives. I've been reading her work for years. If anyone would understand the importance of this collection and help us navigate it ethically, it would be her. And if she can't help us, then we take Crane's offer, Helen said. But we try the right thing first. They spent the next hour transferring the most valuable canisters into the U-Haul, the Hitchcock, the Wells, a few other films that Helen identified as the rarest and most significant. The rest would have to wait for a second trip, but at least they'd have the most important pieces secured. By noon, they had everything loaded into their new storage unit on the other side of town, a climate-controlled space that cost more per month than they'd wanted to spend, but seemed necessary given the value and fragility of what they were protecting. Arthur paid for 3 months up front, watching their checking account dwindle to a number that made his stomach hurt. Back at their apartment, Helen drafted an email to Dr. Evelyn Martinez. She wrote carefully, trying to strike a balance between conveying the significance of what they'd found without sounding insane or like they were trying to pull a hoax. "How does this sound?" she asked, reading it aloud to Arthur. "Dear Dr. Martinez, my name is Helen Patterson, and I've been following your work on lost films and preservation for several years. My husband and I recently acquired a storage unit at auction that appears to contain an extensive collection of rare and potentially lost films, including what may be original materials from several historically significant projects. We're in over our heads and don't know how to proceed. We're not collectors or experts, just two retired people who stumbled into something that seems far too important to handle poorly. Would you be willing to speak with us and possibly examine what we found? We're not looking for free appraisal or trying to waste your time. We genuinely need guidance from someone who understands the cultural and historical significance of film preservation. Thank you for your consideration. Respectfully, Helen Patterson." Arthur nodded. It's good, honest, without giving away too much detail. Helen hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then they waited. The response came 3 hours later, faster than either of them had expected. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Martinez wrote, "your email has piqued my curiosity. Lost film collections turn up occasionally, and they're almost always less significant than the finder hopes. However, I'm intrigued enough to have a conversation. Would you be available for a phone call tomorrow morning?" They scheduled the call for 9 a.m. Helen barely slept that night, rehearsing what she'd say, how much she'd reveal, how to convince Dr. Martinez that this was real and important without sounding like a crazy person claiming to have found Bigfoot. When the call came through, Dr. Martinez's voice was professional but warm, with an undercurrent of cautious interest. Helen explained the basics: the storage unit auction, Leonard Voss's name, the sheer volume of material. She carefully avoided mentioning specific titles, waiting to gauge Martinez's reaction. "Leonard Voss," Martinez said slowly. "Yes, I know that name. He was something of a legend in certain circles, a producer and collector who supposedly had an enormous private archive. He was notoriously secretive about it. Several institutions tried to work with him over the years, but he always refused." "Why?" Helen asked. "Why would someone keep all those films locked away?" Martinez was silent for a moment. "I can only speculate, but in my experience, people like Voss often have complicated relationships with art and ownership. Sometimes they're genuine preservationists who don't trust institutions to care for materials properly. Sometimes they're investors who view films as financial assets. And sometimes," she paused, "sometimes they're collectors who derive their identity from possession. The films make them special, make them important. Sharing them would diminish that." "That's what I thought," Helen said quietly. "May I ask what you're hoping to do with this collection?" Martinez asked. "Are you looking to sell it, donate it, get it properly preserved?" "All of those things," Helen admitted, We need money, I won't pretend we don't, but we also want these films to end up where they belong, where people can see them and study them and appreciate them. We just don't know how to make that happen. I appreciate your honesty, Martinez said. Would you be willing to show me what you have? Not a full inventory, just enough to verify that this is as significant as you believe it to be? They arranged to meet the next day at the storage unit. Helen hung up the phone and looked at Arthur, who'd been listening to the entire conversation. "Do you trust her?" he asked. "I don't know," Helen said honestly, "but I trust her more than I trust Sebastian Crane." The next morning, they met Dr. Martinez at the storage facility. She arrived in a sensible Honda, wearing jeans and a UCLA sweatshirt, carrying a large equipment bag. She was younger than Helen had imagined, maybe 50, with silver-streaked dark hair and the focused intensity of someone who loved their work. Helen opened the storage unit, and Martinez stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the rows of film canisters. "Oh my God," she breathed. "How many are there?" "We've cataloged over 1,500, Arthur said. "We haven't had time to examine all of them carefully, but based on the labels and documentation we found, it's an extensive collection spanning several decades." Martinez set down her bag and pulled out a pair of white cotton gloves. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the canisters. "Please," Helen said. They watched as Martinez began carefully examining the materials. She checked labels, inspected seals, occasionally pulled out a loupe to examine the film canisters more closely. Her hands moved with practiced care, and her expression became increasingly odd. "This is real," she said finally, her voice shaking slightly. "This is actually real. I'm holding— Do you know what this is?" She indicated the canister in her hands. "This is a director's cut of a Kubrick film. The director's cut. There are maybe a dozen people in the world who even knew this existed." "Is it valuable?" Arthur asked. Martinez looked at him with an expression that mingled disbelief and amusement. "Valuable? Mr. Patterson, this collection is priceless, not in a hyperbolic way. I mean, it's genuinely impossible to put a market value on materials this rare and historically significant. Individual pieces could sell for millions. The entire collection? I can't even begin to estimate." "Try," Helen said. Martinez set down the canister carefully. "If I had to guess, and this is just a preliminary assessment, you're looking at somewhere between $80 and $150 million, possibly more depending on condition and authentication. But that's if you sold everything to private collectors at auction, which would be the worst possible outcome from a preservation standpoint." Arthur felt the floor shift beneath him. $80 million, $150 million. Numbers so large they felt meaningless, like counting grains of sand on a beach. "What would be the best outcome?" Helen asked quietly. "From a preservation standpoint?" Martinez walked slowly down the row of canisters, her hand trailing along them, almost reverently. "The best outcome would be partnering with a major institution, the Academy Film Archive, the Library of Congress, or a major university collection. They could properly preserve these materials, digitize them, make them available to scholars, and eventually to the public. They'd give you fair market value for the collection, handle all the legal complexities, and ensure these films survive for future generations." "But not $80 million, Arthur said. "No," Martinez admitted. "Probably more like 15 to 20 million, split between several institutions, with the deal structured over time to minimize tax burden and legal challenges. It's still an enormous amount of money, but it's a fraction of what you could get from private collectors." She turned to face them. "I need to be honest with you. If you want to maximize profit, I'm not the person to help you. There are brokers and auction houses that specialize in this kind of thing. They'll get you more money, but those films will disappear into private collections where almost no one will ever see them. They'll be investment pieces, stored in climate-controlled vaults, appreciating in value, benefiting no one. Like Leonard Voss did, Helen said. Exactly like Leonard Voss did, Martinez confirmed. He probably could have sold this collection for a fortune at any point, but he kept it hidden, kept it for himself, and ultimately it ended up in a storage unit that went into foreclosure. All that history, all that art, locked away and forgotten. But we found it, Arthur pointed out. It's not forgotten anymore. No, Martinez agreed. You found it, and now you get to decide what happens to it. I can't make that decision for you, and I won't judge you regardless of what you choose. But I'm asking you to consider the cultural significance of what you're holding. These aren't just valuable objects. They're windows into artistic vision, into history, into human creativity at its highest level. Helen and Arthur looked at each other, having one of their wordless conversations that came from decades of marriage. Arthur saw the conflict in his wife's eyes, the practical need for money warring with her librarian soul, her lifelong commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge. "Can we think about it?" Helen asked. "We've already been approached by a private collector offering $5 million for the entire collection. We have," she glanced at her watch, "about 16 hours before that offer expires." Martinez's expression darkened. "Sebastian Crane? You know him?" Arthur asked. "I know of him," Martinez said grimly. "He represents several ultra-wealthy collectors who treat films like baseball cards, rare commodities to be acquired and hoarded. He's notorious for lowball offers to people who don't know any better. $5 million for this collection is insulting." "It's more money than we've ever seen," Helen said quietly. "I know," Martinez said, and her voice was gentle now. "I know. It must seem like a fortune. But you need to understand, Crane isn't offering you $5 million because that's what it's worth. He's offering $5 million because he knows he can turn around and sell individual pieces for 10 times that to his clients. He's counting on you being desperate enough to take the first offer that comes along." "We are desperate," Arthur said, surprised by the bitterness in his own voice. "We live on Social Security. Our apartment is the size of this storage unit. We're one medical emergency away from being homeless. Don't tell us about cultural significance when you've probably never had to choose between medicine and food." The words hung in the air, harsh and true. Martinez's face softened with something that looked like understanding. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry. That was privileged of me. You didn't ask to be put in this position, and it's not fair to expect you to sacrifice your financial security for abstract ideals about cultural preservation." She pulled a card from her wallet and handed it to Helen. "Here's what I can offer. Let me help you authenticate and properly value what you have. I'll connect you with institutions that can make fair offers. I'll help you navigate the legal complexities pro bono. You won't pay me a cent unless and until you make a deal. And if, at the end of all that, you still want to take Crane's offer or sell to private collectors, I'll respect that decision and help you do it in the way that benefits you most." "Why would you do that?" Arthur asked suspiciously. "What do you get out of it?" Martinez smiled slightly. "Professional pride? A chance to be part of preserving some of the most important lost films in cinema history? Maybe just the knowledge that I tried to do the right thing?" She shrugged. "Look, I'm a professor at a state university. I'm not rich, but I'm comfortable. I don't need to profit from this. But I do care deeply about film preservation, and I hate seeing important materials disappear into private collections where they'll never be studied or shared." Helen looked at the card, then at her husband. Arthur saw the question in her eyes, the hope mixed with fear. They were being asked to trust a stranger, to bet their financial future on the promise that doing the right thing would somehow work out. It was terrifying. "Okay," Helen said before Arthur could talk her out of it. "Help us. We have 16 hours before Crane's offer expires. Show us what's possible in that time, and we'll make our decision." Martinez's face lit up. "You won't regret this, I promise." She spent the next 6 hours methodically examining the collection. She brought in a colleague, an expert in film authentication, who arrived with portable equipment to test film stock, examine chemical properties, and verify that the materials were what they claimed to be. Arthur and Helen watched as the two professors worked with an intensity and focus that reminded Helen of her own days as a librarian, the pure joy of discovery and organization. By 4 p.m., Martinez had compiled a preliminary report. She pulled up a document on her laptop and turned it so Arthur and Helen could see. "Here's what we've verified so far," she said. "The Hitchcock film is authentic, original camera negative in remarkably good condition. The Wells materials are exactly what they claim to be. We've spot-checked about 30 other high-value pieces, and everything is checking out." Based on this sampling and the documentation we found, I'm confident that most of this collection is legitimate. She pulled up another screen. "I've already been in contact with 3 major institutions, the Academy Film Archive, the Library of Congress, and the UCLA Film and Television Archive. All 3 are interested in making offers, pending full authentication. I've also reached out to the Kubrick estate, the Hitchcock estate, and several other relevant parties who might want to participate in acquisitions." "How much?" Arthur asked, his stomach tight. Martinez met his eyes. "They're talking about a joint consortium approach, multiple institutions pooling resources to make a comprehensive acquisition. Early estimates are in the range of 25 to 35 million, structured as a tax-advantaged charitable contribution that would actually net you more than that after deductions. The deal would take probably 3 to 6 months to finalize, but they're prepared to offer you a bridge loan against the appraised value immediately, so you'd have liquid capital while the details get worked out." Arthur felt lightheaded. $25 million! Not as much as the collection could theoretically bring at private auction, but life-changing nonetheless. Enough to solve every problem, secure every future, help every grandchild. "And Crane's offer expires in 12 hours, Helen said. "Crane's offer was never real," Martinez said bluntly. "He was banking on you being scared and desperate enough to take a fraction of what this is worth. If you turn him down, he'll come back with a higher offer. And if you ignore him entirely and work with legitimate institutions, he'll eventually disappear. Or he'll make trouble for us," Arthur said. He seemed like the type to make trouble. Martinez's expression turned grim. "He might try, but the institutions I'm connecting you with have legal resources that dwarf anything Crane can bring to bear." Once you're working with the Academy Film Archive or the Library of Congress, you're protected by their institutional weight and expertise. Helen's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her face went pale. "It's Crane. He's texted me. Have you made your decision? The clock is ticking." "Don't respond," Martinez advised. "Let him sweat. You have better options now." But as evening approached and they prepared to leave the storage facility, Arthur felt a growing sense of unease. They were turning down guaranteed money they could touch and spend right now, for promises from institutions that might take months to materialize. What if something went wrong? What if the deals fell through? What if they ended up with nothing? As if reading his thoughts, Helen squeezed his hand. "We're doing the right thing," she said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I hope so," Arthur replied. They drove home in silence, and when they reached their apartment building, they found Sebastian Crane waiting in the lobby. "We need to talk," he said. Arthur felt a flash of anger. "How did you find where we live?" "I'm a resourceful person," Crane said smoothly. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." Against his better judgment, Arthur led Crane up to their apartment. Helen made tea. No one drank, while Crane stood in their tiny living space, looking around with barely concealed disdain. "I know you've been talking to Evelyn Martinez," Crane said without preamble. "And I know she's filled your head with ideas about working with museums and archives. I'm here to give you a reality check." "We don't want to hear it," Helen said, But Crane continued anyway. Those institutional deals take forever. 6 months is optimistic. More like a year or 2 once you factor in authentication, legal challenges, and bureaucratic red tape. And there will be legal challenges. Every studio whose logo appears on those canisters will claim ownership. Every director's estate will file suit.
You'll be buried in litigation that you can't afford. Dr. Martinez said the institutions would handle that, Arthur said. Crane laughed without humor. They'll try, but in the meantime, you'll be in limbo. No money, mounting legal bills, watching your dream of security evaporate while lawyers fight over who owns what. Is that really what you want for your final years? As opposed to being robbed by you? Helen shot back. Crane's expression hardened. I'm not robbing anyone. I'm offering you a clean exit. But I'll be honest, I'm done negotiating. My final offer is $8 million, cash, within 48 hours. Take it or leave it, but understand that if you turn this down, you're choosing years of uncertainty over immediate security. Get out, Helen said. Crane looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. Your funeral, he said, and left. After he was gone, Arthur and Helen sat on their fold-out couch, neither speaking. $8 million. The number had doubled, just as Martinez predicted. But it came wrapped in threats and pressure and the sinking feeling that Crane was right about at least some of what he'd said. I'm scared, Helen admitted. What if he's right? What if we end up with nothing? Then we'll have nothing, Arthur said. Which is what we had before we bought that storage unit. We'll survive. Will we? Helen asked. I'm 73 years old, Arthur. How many years do I have left? 10? 20 if I'm lucky? Do I want to spend them fighting legal battles over film canisters, or do I want to actually enjoy the time I have left? It was the question Arthur had been avoiding asking himself. Because the answer, the honest answer, was that he wanted security. He wanted to stop worrying about money, stop counting pennies, stop feeling invisible and irrelevant. He wanted to matter, and money was the only language the world seemed to understand. But he also wanted to be able to look at himself in the mirror. And he wasn't sure he could do that if they let Leonard Voss's collection disappear into another wealthy person's private vault. Let's sleep on it, he said finally. One more night. We'll decide in the morning. But sleep was impossible. Arthur lay awake listening to traffic outside, Helen's breathing beside him, the tick of the cheap clock on the wall. His mind spun through calculations and possibilities, fears and hopes, trying to find a path through the impossible choice they faced. Around 3 a.m., Helen spoke into the darkness. I keep thinking about my library. What about it? Arthur asked. When they closed it, when they eliminated my position, they said it was about budget efficiency. They said people didn't use libraries anymore, that everything was digital now. But that wasn't true. People used the library all the time. Kids doing homework, elderly people checking out large print books, immigrants learning English, homeless people escaping the cold. The library mattered, but it didn't generate revenue, so it was expendable. She rolled over to facing in the dark. That's what will happen to these films if they go into private collections. They'll be safe, they'll be preserved, but they'll be expendable to everyone except the person who owns them. No film students will study them. No researchers will analyze them. No audiences will experience them. They'll exist in a vault somewhere, generating value for their owner while contributing nothing to the world. I know, Arthur said. I don't want to be part of that, Helen said. I spent my whole career making information accessible to people. I'm not going to spend my retirement helping seal away cinema history for some billionaire's investment portfolio. Arthur reached out and found her hand in the darkness. Even if it means we struggle, Even if the institutional deals fall through and we end up with less than Crane is offering? Even then, Helen said, we've struggled before. We'll struggle again. But at least we'll do it, knowing we didn't contribute to hoarding the world's cultural heritage. Arthur felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. Okay, he said. Then we tell Crane no, and we work with Martinez and the institutions, and we see what happens. You're sure? Helen asked. I'm sure, Arthur said, and realized it was true. The next morning, Arthur sent a text to Sebastian Crane. Thank you for your offers, but we're pursuing other options. Please don't contact us again. Crane's response was immediate. You're making a terrible mistake. Arthur blocked his number. Then they called Dr. Martinez and told her they were ready to move forward with the institutional partnerships. Her relief was audible through the phone. You won't regret this, she said. I promise, we're going to make sure you're taken care of while doing right by these films. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. Authentication experts examined every canister. Legal teams from 3 major institutions negotiated with studios, estates, and each other. Arthur and Helen signed more documents than they thought possible, each one reviewed carefully by the pro bono lawyers Martinez had connected them with. And slowly, miraculously, the deals came together. The Academy Film Archive acquired the Hitchcock materials for $12 million. The Library of Congress purchased the bulk of the collection's historically significant American films for $8 million. UCLA took the international and avant-garde pieces for $6 million. Various smaller institutions acquired specialized materials, bringing the total to just under $30 million. Structured as a charitable contribution with a purchase component, the deal netted Arthur and Helen $23 million after taxes, money that would arrive in stages over 18 months with a $5 million advance available immediately. It was less than the collection could have brought at private auction. It was less than some of the later offers Crane had made before finally disappearing. But it was enough. God, it was enough. With the advance, they bought a modest house with enough room for a home office and a guest bedroom for Emma when she visited. They set up trust funds for their grandchildren. They donated $1 million to organizations that supported library preservation and access, and they still had more money than they needed for the rest of their lives. But more than the money, they had something else: purpose. The institutions invited them to be part of the preservation process. They attended screenings of the restored films. They spoke at conferences about the importance of film preservation. They met directors and scholars and preservationists who were grateful beyond measure for what they'd done. And one evening, 2 years after that first day in the storage unit, they sat in a packed theater at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures for the world premiere of Hitchcock's restored The Storm Within. The film was stunning, a late-career masterpiece about guilt and memory and the impossibility of escaping your past. The audience gave it a 10-minute standing ovation, and when the credits rolled, they included a dedication. This presentation made possible through the generosity of Arthur and Helen Patterson, who chose to share this treasure with the world. People were crying. Arthur was crying. Helen squeezed his hand so hard it hurt, and when he looked at her, he saw that she was glowing with a kind of joy he hadn't seen in years. After the screening, a young woman approached them, maybe 25, with the earnest intensity of a film student. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. I'm writing my dissertation on late Hitchcock, and this film changes everything we thought we knew about his final years. You've made my entire academic career possible. We're just glad people can see it," Helen said. "It's more than that," the woman insisted. "You could have sold these films to collectors who would have locked them away forever, but you didn't. You chose to share them. That matters. That really matters." After she walked away, Arthur turned to Helen. "Do you ever regret it? Not taking Crane's money? Not maximizing profit?" Helen was quiet for a moment, watching the crowd file out of the theater, still buzzing with excitement about what they'd just witnessed.
No, she said finally. I regret a lot of things in my life, Arthur, but not this. Never this. They walked out of the theater into the warm Los Angeles evening, just two elderly people among the crowd, invisible again, in a way, but also not. Because somewhere in that crowd, and in crowds at other screenings, at universities and archives and film festivals around the world, people were experiencing films that might have been lost forever. Films that existed now because Arthur and Helen had chosen to share rather than hoard, to preserve rather than profit, to think beyond their own needs to something larger. Leonard Voss had spent decades accumulating cinematic treasures and locking them away where no one could see them. He died alone, his collection forgotten, his name mentioned only in footnotes and rumors. But Arthur and Helen, they'd be remembered differently, as the couple who found a fortune in lost films and gave them back to the world, as ordinary people who'd made an extraordinary choice. And sometimes, late at night in their comfortable house, when Helen was reading in bed and Arthur was puttering in the kitchen making tea, they'd look at each other and smile, because they knew something that no amount of money could buy. They mattered. Their choice had mattered. Their lives had created ripples that would echo forward for generations. The films had been lost, then found, then shared. And in the sharing, in the choosing to make art accessible rather than exclusive, Arthur and Helen had found something they'd thought they'd lost: dignity, purpose, and the knowledge that even at the end of their lives, they could still contribute something meaningful to the world. That was worth more than any number of millions. That was worth everything.